A mountain in West Virginia once swallowed men whole, and nobody outside a few small towns ever knew their names. They walked into a hole in the rock healthy, strong, and full of hope for a paycheck. Months later, many of them could not climb a single flight of stairs without gasping for air. By the time anyone in Washington paid attention, hundreds of bodies had already been buried in unmarked ground, and the company responsible had already moved on to its next project. To understand how this happened, the story has to begin not inside the tunnel but far above it, in the boardrooms of one of the largest corporations in the country. Union Carbide needed enormous amounts of electricity to run a metals plant it was building along the New River, and the cheapest way to secure that power was to bend the river itself to its will. On paper, the plan looked almost elegant in its simplicity, cutting a passage through Gauley Mountain, redirecting the river's flow through that passage, and letting the drop in elevation generate hydroelectric power for a facility that would turn out ferroalloys used in steel production across the country. The company hired to carry out the physical work was Reinhardt and Dennis, a construction firm out of Virginia with a reputation for boring through rock quickly and cheaply. What they were asked to build was staggering for its time, a tunnel stretching for miles through solid stone, wide enough to swallow a small building whole. Completing it ahead of schedule mattered more to everyone involved than almost anything else. Speed meant profit, and profit meant bonuses for the men running the operation and steady electricity flowing to the plant downstream. The timing could not have been worse for the workers who would end up inside that mountain. The country had just tipped into the Great Depression, and steady wages of any kind had become nearly impossible to find. Recruiters fanned out across the South, promising reliable pay and steady meals to men who had spent years scraping by on farms and lumber camps or on the railroads. They found willing hands in Georgia and the Carolinas, in small rural communities where a former plantation offered little future beyond more hard labor for less pay, and the overwhelming majority of the men who answered these recruiters were black. A smaller number were local white residents of the surrounding hills who needed work just as badly and signed on for the same reasons that drove everyone else to the mountain. None of them had any real idea what they were walking into. They arrived by truck and on foot, carrying whatever belongings they owned, expecting hard labor and long hours, which was exactly what they had been promised. What they were not told, and what the company already knew before a single shovel touched the ground, was what kind of rock sat waiting for them inside that mountain. Engineers had already taken core samples from Gauley Mountain before construction began. Those samples revealed something the company found useful, and the workers would never be told about. The rock inside was almost pure silica, some of the purest deposits found anywhere in the region, so valuable that it would later be sold separately as an industrial material for glass and ferroalloy production. The same mineral that made the rock commercially attractive was about to make the tunnel one of the deadliest workplaces in American history, and the company knew it long before the first blast went off. Union Carbide's ambitions stretched well beyond a single tunnel. The metals plant waiting at the end of this project was designed to produce alloys essential to the booming steel industry, materials that strengthened everything from automobiles to industrial machinery across the country. Every month of delay meant lost revenue on contracts already signed, and every month the tunnel finished early meant additional profit layered on top of an already lucrative deal. Executives far removed from the mountain itself made decisions about pace and cost that would ultimately be carried out, quite literally, in the lungs of men they would likely never meet in person. Local officials in the surrounding counties had little power to intervene even if they had wanted to. Union Carbide represented an enormous source of jobs and tax revenue for a region hit hard by the collapsing economy, and few politicians in Fayette County were eager to challenge a company capable of reshaping the local economy with a single decision. That imbalance of power, a struggling rural county facing off against one of the wealthiest corporations in the nation, shaped nearly every decision made once construction actually began. Word of the project spread quickly through towns that had almost nothing to offer their young men besides hunger. Buses and trucks arrived in small courthouse squares and church parking lots, and within days entire groups of laborers had signed on, sometimes without fully understanding how far West Virginia was from home, or how different mountain work would be from anything they had known. For many it felt less like a decision and more like the only door still open. A handful of men who took the job later admitted they had heard faint warnings before leaving home. Older relatives who had worked construction elsewhere, cautioning them about rock work in general terms, without any specific knowledge of what this particular mountain contained. Those warnings rarely carried enough weight to outweigh the promise of steady pay during a period when steady pay of any kind felt like a small miracle. Hunger has a way of quieting caution, And for these men, hunger had already been doing its work for years before a single recruiter ever knocked on a door. The journey itself told them almost nothing about what waited on the other end. Men who had never left their home counties found themselves crossing state lines for the first time, packed into trucks and rail cars, heading toward mountains they had only heard described in passing. Some traveled with brothers or cousins, hoping that at least they would face whatever came next together. Others arrived completely alone, carrying a single bag and whatever cash they had left after the trip, trusting the promises made to them by strangers with clipboards back home. When they finally reached Gauley Bridge, the mountain scenery must have felt almost unreal after the flat farmland. Many of them had grown up working. Steep ridges rose on every side of a narrow river valley, and the mountain itself loomed over the small settlement like something permanent and unmovable. Nobody handed these new arrivals a warning about what sat inside that rock. They were shown where to sleep, told when their shift began, and sent to collect their tools. And that was the entire orientation most of them ever received before walking into the dark for the first time. Work began in the spring, with crews organized into shifts that ran through the day and into the night. Men operated heavy pneumatic drills, hammering into the stone to prepare holes for dynamite. Once the charges blew, crews moved back in almost immediately to clear the rubble and push the tunnel forward another few feet. It was brutal, physical work carried out in cramped, dim conditions, with rock dust hanging thick in the air after every single blast, sometimes so heavy that men could barely see the crew working beside them. Here is where the disaster truly took root. Drilling could be done wet, spraying water onto the rock face to keep dust from filling the air, or it could be done dry, which moved faster but filled every breath with fine particles of stone. Reinhardt and Dennis chose speed almost every time. Wet drilling slowed progress and cost money in water systems and lost hours. Dry drilling let crews push forward at a blistering pace, hundreds of feet a week, an achievement the company would later celebrate publicly. What that pace actually meant, hidden from anyone reading about the project in a newspaper, was that men spent 10, sometimes 12 or more hours a day breathing air thick with pulverized silica, with almost no ventilation to clear it out before the next shift walked in. There was a legal detail buried in how the project was classified that made all of this possible. Had the tunnel been labeled a mining operation, certain dust control expectations already forming at the time might have applied. Instead, it was classified as a civil engineering project, a distinction that let the company sidestep protections that could otherwise have forced safer conditions from the very start. No respirators were handed out to the men doing the drilling, and no adequate ventilation system was installed until it was far too late to matter for the crews who had already spent months breathing that air. The physical hazards inside the tunnel went well beyond dust alone. Dynamite blasts loosened sections of rock overhead that did not always fall exactly where crews expected, and cave-ins injured or killed workers separately from the disease slowly building in their lungs. Rail carts hauling debris out of the tunnel moved constantly through the same cramped space where men were working, adding another layer of danger to shifts already stretched dangerously long. Lighting inside the tunnel remained poor throughout construction, leaving crews to work by lantern and by whatever daylight managed to reach the deeper sections, which was often very little at all. Once the tunnel extended more than a short distance into the mountain, life outside the tunnel offered little relief from what was happening inside it. Workers lived in labor camps scattered around Gauley Bridge, housed in cramped, segregated quarters barely large enough to hold a bed and a change of clothes. Some of these structures were converted boxcars, packed with far more men than they were ever built for, with thin walls that did little against the cold mountain nights. Pay came out to about 25 cents an hour, appealing during a depression, but nowhere near enough to offset what the work was costing these men physically. Many were paid partly in company scrip that tied them to company stores, deepening their dependence on the very operation that was putting their health at risk with every shift. Sundays offered the only real break in the schedule, a single day to wash clothes, write letters home, or simply rest a body already beginning to wear down faster than anyone had expected. Within the first few months, something strange began happening that nobody working there had a name for yet. Men who had arrived strong and capable started coughing during meals and struggling to fall asleep. They grew short of breath doing tasks that should have taken no effort at all. Some described a tightness in the chest that never fully eased, even after a full night's rest. At first, these symptoms seemed minor, the kind of thing anyone might expect from hard labor in a new climate. Nobody yet understood they were watching the earliest stages of a disease that would kill hundreds of them within a matter of months and years. Not the decades doctors of the time believed such a disease required. Foremen pushed the pace regardless of how the men looked or felt, since every foot of tunnel completed early moved the entire operation closer to its bonus deadline. Supervisors themselves were not entirely spared either. Dozens of the men overseeing the drilling crews eventually developed the same symptoms as the laborers below them, breathing the same dust for hours at a time even if their work was slightly removed from the drill face itself. That detail alone should have told the company everything it needed to know about what was happening inside that mountain. Yet the pace of construction barely slowed at all. Inside the tunnel itself, the atmosphere grew thicker with each passing month, not just with dust but with a quiet dread the men rarely spoke about openly. Workers noticed which of their crewmates had started coughing more, who had grown thinner, who had stopped showing up for a shift without explanation. Some men quietly walked away from the job entirely once they understood what was happening, forfeiting whatever pay they were still owed rather than risk another day underground. Others had nowhere else to go and no other income waiting for them, so they kept reporting for their shift even as their own bodies began sending unmistakable warnings. Doctors of the era understood silicosis as a slow disease, something that crept up on miners after 20 or 30 years of steady, repeated exposure. What was happening at Gauley Mountain broke every rule they thought they knew about how the human lung failed. Men who had been drilling for only a few months were already struggling to climb a short flight of stairs. Some who left the tunnel after a single season were dead within a year of walking away from it. The concentration of pure silica dust inside that tunnel was so extreme that it compressed decades of typical exposure into a matter of weeks for the men working closest to the drill faces. Rather than acknowledge what was happening, company doctors gave the illness a different name entirely. They called it tunnelitis, describing it to sick men as a temporary respiratory irritation rather than the permanent fatal lung disease it actually was. Sick workers were handed pills that did nothing meaningful and were sent back underground, or simply dismissed without pay once their bodies could no longer sustain the pace of the work. The company had every incentive to avoid the word silicosis in any official record. Acknowledging it openly would have meant acknowledging liability for hundreds of lives, and liability meant money the company had no interest in spending on men it viewed as easily replaced. What silicosis actually does to the human body is brutal, and, in its acute form, remarkably fast. Sharp, microscopic particles of crystalline silica settle deep into lung tissue and never leave the body again. In response, the body forms scar tissue around each particle, and over time that scarring hardens the lungs until they can no longer expand the way healthy lungs should. Breathing becomes a physical struggle, each inhale shallower than the one before it, until the simplest movement, walking across a room or climbing a short set of stairs, becomes an exhausting ordeal. In the acute form seen at Gauley Mountain, death could come within months of the very first symptoms appearing, a speed that stunned even experienced physicians once they finally understood what they were looking at. Survivors of the period later described men gasping so desperately for air in their final hours that some tore at their own bedding in the struggle simply to breathe. Family members who sat beside these men in their final days often had no real understanding of what was killing them. They had been told it was pneumonia or a lingering cold that had simply refused to clear, explanations that made no sense given how quickly a strong young man could go from working full shifts to being unable to leave his bed. Some families spent what little savings they had on remedies that could never have worked against a disease nobody outside a handful of specialists had even properly identified yet, chasing hope in the only direction anyone had offered them. As the deaths mounted, the company's response was not to slow the work but to manage how it appeared from the outside. Sick men were quietly dismissed rather than treated properly or compensated. Some who died far from the tunnel, having gone home to family after realizing they could no longer keep working, were never counted among the official casualties at all, since their deaths technically happened away from the immediate work site. Rumors persisted for years afterward that some of the dead, men without family nearby to claim their bodies, were buried quickly and without markers in a nearby field, a detail that would later horrify investigators trying to determine exactly how many men had actually died as a result of the project. The town nearest the tunnel began to earn a grim reputation among those who lived through those years, remembered afterward as a place where the living seemed to be dying in plain sight while construction above ground continued without pause. Men who had once been strong enough to swing a sledgehammer for 10 hours a day were reduced within a season or two to walking skeletons, their bodies stripped of muscle and fat as the disease consumed them from the inside, while their co-workers kept drilling just a few hundred feet away. It took a local physician, troubled by how many young men were dying of what he was told was simple pneumonia, to finally look deeper than the official explanation. He began performing autopsies on several of the deceased workers, expecting to find nothing unusual beyond overwork and poor nutrition. What he found instead were lungs that had turned hard and fibrous, packed with the same silica dust the men had been breathing every single day inside the tunnel. His findings gave the disease its true name for the first time in an official medical setting, though by then the company had already sent thousands of men through that same environment, and hundreds of them were already gone. Even once a name existed for what was killing these workers, changing course would have meant admitting fault on a scale the company had no intention of accepting. Production continued at nearly the same pace it always had. New recruits kept arriving from the south to replace the men who had become too sick to work, most of them just as unaware of the danger as the crews who had come before them, walking into the exact same conditions that had already claimed so many lives. For well over a year, almost none of this reached the outside world. The tunnel sat in a remote stretch of Appalachia, far from major newspapers, and far from anyone with the power or the interest to intervene on the workers' behalf. That began to change when a local newspaper, small but persistent, started asking pointed questions about why so many young, healthy men kept turning up dead or desperately ill after working on the same project just outside town. When the story finally broke in print, describing the sickness spreading through the work camps and the conditions the men were enduring day after day, a local judge issued an order shutting down further coverage almost immediately. For a moment it looked as though the company might actually succeed in keeping the disaster contained within a few rural counties, hidden from wider public view by little more than distance and a well-timed legal maneuver aimed at a single small paper. But word does not stay buried forever, especially once families start burying their sons, husbands, and brothers in numbers far too large to explain away as ordinary bad luck. Survivors began talking to anyone who would listen. Families of the dead began comparing stories with one another across county lines, and slowly realizing the scale of what had happened was far larger than any single town could quietly absorb. Lawyers took notice of the pattern, and soon hundreds of lawsuits were filed against Reinhardt and Dennis and against Union Carbide itself, seeking compensation for lives destroyed and lives lost entirely too young. Inside the courtroom, these cases often turned into grueling battles over medical definitions rather than straightforward questions of responsibility. Company lawyers argued at length over what exactly qualified as silicosis, how quickly it could realistically develop, and whether conditions inside the tunnel had truly caused the specific illnesses being described by exhausted, often uneducated witnesses unfamiliar with legal proceedings. Many of the men called to testify were themselves too sick to speak for long, giving their accounts in halting, breathless sentences that left little doubt about their condition. Even as opposing lawyers tried to pick apart the details of their testimony, judges presiding over these cases often had little precedent to draw from. Since so few disasters of this scale had ever reached a civil courtroom involving an industrial disease rather than a single sudden accident, every ruling handed down became a small, uncertain step into new legal territory, watched closely by other companies across the country, wondering whether they too might eventually face similar claims from workers exposed to comparable hazards in mines, foundries, and quarries far beyond West Virginia. The lawsuits dragged through the courts for years, hampered by limited medical understanding of the disease, by witnesses too sick or too poor to travel for testimony, and by a legal system in that era that offered little genuine sympathy to migrant black laborers seeking damages from one of the country's most powerful corporations. When settlements eventually came, they reflected the deep inequalities of the era as much as they reflected any real sense of justice. Payments were calculated differently, depending on a worker's race and marital status, with white workers and married men typically receiving far more than black or single laborers, regardless of how similar their suffering had actually been. One woman who lost 3 sons, a brother, and eventually her own husband to the disease was awarded a substantial sum on paper, yet ended up with barely a portion of it once legal fees and administrative costs had quietly eaten away at the total. Public attention, once it finally arrived, came through channels the company could not silence with a single court order. Writers and poets who learned of what had happened at Gauley Mountain began traveling there themselves, sitting down with survivors and with the families left behind to hear their stories firsthand. Their work carried the story of the tunnel far beyond Appalachia, turning what had been a hidden regional tragedy into a piece of American labor history that could no longer be dismissed or forgotten, even by those who would have much preferred it stayed buried alongside the men who died building it. One poet in particular spent considerable time gathering testimony directly from survivors and grieving relatives. traveling through the same valley where the tunnel sat and sitting in kitchens and on porches, listening to accounts nobody in a courtroom had bothered to hear in full. The resulting collection of writing, published later in the decade, gave voice to men whose names had never appeared in a single newspaper article while they were alive. For readers across the country who had never heard of Gauley Bridge or Reinhardt and Dennis, this was often the first real glimpse into what had actually happened inside that mountain, delivered not through legal filings or corporate statements, but through the plain, direct words of the people who had lived through it themselves. Newspapers in larger cities eventually picked up pieces of the story as well, though never with the sustained attention the scale of the disaster seemed to demand. For a brief period, Hawk's Nest became a symbol invoked by labor organizers and reformers pushing for stronger federal oversight of industrial working conditions nationwide. Yet even that attention faded within a few years, overtaken by other headlines, and eventually by the far larger crisis of a world sliding toward war, leaving the men who had died in that tunnel to fade from public memory almost as quickly as they had briefly entered it. Years after the tunnel itself was finished and put to use, the disaster finally reached the halls of Congress. A subcommittee convened hearings, gathering testimony from survivors, from widows, and from the small number of company officials willing to answer questions under oath about what had actually happened on the project. What emerged was a portrait of almost total disregard for human life, described by the committee itself in language that left little room for polite interpretation. Investigators concluded that the entire project had been carried out with what they called grave and inhuman disregard for the health and futures of the men who built it. Language, they said, felt more fitting for an earlier and far darker century than for a modern industrial nation. Even with findings that Sevier laid out plainly on the record, Congress took no further binding action. No criminal charges followed against the men who had made the decisions that led to hundreds of deaths. No federal agency stepped in to hold the company financially accountable, beyond what had already been settled quietly in civil court years earlier. The people responsible faced little meaningful consequence beyond some damage to their public reputation, and even that faded faster than anyone who had lost a family member could have imagined at the time. Witnesses who did testify described conditions that shocked even hardened members of the committee, men who had sat through other hearings on dangerous industries and thought little could still surprise them. They heard accounts of men so wasted by illness that they resembled figures from famine rather than laborers from an American worksite. They heard widows describe husbands who had died gasping on their own front porches, having walked away from the tunnel specifically to spare their families the sight of them dying underground. None of it, in the end, translated into the kind of accountability that might have felt like justice to the families sitting in that hearing room. What the disaster did accomplish, slowly and imperfectly over the following years, was a real shift in how the country began approaching workplace safety. Silicosis moved from an obscure medical term familiar only to a handful of specialists into a widely recognized occupational hazard, one that eventually earned legal protections and compensation frameworks in many states across the country. Dust control standards that should have existed before a single man ever picked up a drill inside Gauley Mountain finally began appearing in mining and tunneling regulations nationwide. It came far too late for the laborers who had already died breathing that mountain in, and even the new protections often failed to cover contract laborers, working the same way the Hawk's Nest crews had worked, a gap that allowed smaller, quieter versions of the same tragedy to continue for decades afterward in other tunnels and other mines. Decades later, when federal agencies overseeing workplace health finally developed detailed standards limiting silica exposure across entire industries, historians and safety advocates traced a direct line back to Gauley Mountain. It stands even now as the disaster most often cited whenever regulators explain why crystalline silica dust deserves such careful control, a grim founding chapter in a much longer and still ongoing effort to protect workers whose jobs put them in direct contact with hazardous mineral dust of any kind. Engineers studying tunnel safety today still reference Gauley Mountain as a defining case study, a stark illustration of what happens when the fastest possible timeline is allowed to override every basic precaution available at the time. Modern tunneling projects now carry ventilation requirements, air quality monitoring, and mandatory protective equipment that would have seemed extraordinary to the laborers who reported for their first shift in the early 1930s, carrying nothing more than a drill and a lunch pail. The exact number of men who died from what happened inside that mountain has never been settled with full certainty, and it likely never will be. Company records captured only a narrow slice of the deaths, since so many workers left the project before dying. carrying the disease home to farms and small towns scattered across the South, where their deaths were never formally connected back to the tunnel at all. Later researchers, working decades afterward with far more complete medical and legal records than investigators had access to at the time, pieced together a toll that climbed steadily into the hundreds, and some estimates suggest the true number may have approached 1,000 men once every uncounted, unrecorded death is finally considered. Today, very little remains at the site to suggest how large this tragedy actually was. The tunnel itself still functions exactly as designed, quietly carrying water to generate power just as it has for nearly a century, largely unnoticed by the people who benefit from the electricity it produces. A small cemetery holds some of the men who never made it home to their families, their graves marked simply, if they are marked at all after so many decades of neglect. A modest roadside sign offers a few sentences of explanation to anyone who happens to stop and actually read it. A brief acknowledgement of one of the deadliest industrial disasters in the history of the United States, one that remains largely unknown outside the small community, still quietly shaped by its memory. Visitors who do make the trip to that small cemetery often describe an unsettling quiet to the place, a hillside far removed from any monument grand enough to match the scale of what happened nearby. Many of the graves list only partial names or none at all, a permanent reminder of how completely the identities of these men were allowed to slip through the cracks of official record-keeping while they were still alive. Local historians and descendants of survivors have spent years trying to piece together fuller lists of the dead, cross-referencing scattered church records, old employment ledgers, and family recollections passed down across 3 or 4 generations, work that continues quietly even now, nearly a century after the last blast echoed out of that mountain. Some descendants of the men who worked that tunnel only learned the full story generations later, piecing together fragments from relatives who had spent a lifetime reluctant to discuss what happened to a father or an uncle who went to West Virginia for steady work and came home a different man if he came home at all. For these families, the story is not simply distant history. It remains a living thread connecting them to a tragedy the rest of the country has largely allowed itself to forget. The men who walked into Gauley Mountain believed they were signing up for hard, honest labor during the hardest years their country had ever faced. Instead, many of them signed away their lives without ever understanding the risk, sent into a mountain that the company running the project already knew was laced with poison, all in the name of finishing a job months early and collecting a bonus for the trouble. Their story remains one of the starkest examples in American history of what happens when profit is allowed to outweigh every other consideration a company owes the people working for it. And it stands today as a quiet, largely forgotten warning about the true cost paid by ordinary people when nobody with power is willing to look out for them in time.